Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erika. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast, or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
And happy Mind Games Week.
I was just going to say the same to you, Erika, because, very exciting about Mind Games, and so much fun stuff's been going down online, and we're going to talk about it all.
This has been so great. But first, we have something to announce.
Yeah, something exciting from us is we've got another giveaway. This is our first one of the year, if you can believe it. And we have something very special for you guys. So the nice people over at UMG, our friends over there, have given us a couple of copies of Mind Games to give away. So we've got some CDs and some records. So you can go over to our website at bcthebeatles.com. And on the left side, you'll see monthly giveaway in the menu. Click that and you'll be taken to a link to enter our giveaway. And it's going on from now until August 12th. And then we will pick the winner or winners, we'll see, and email you, see what you want, CD or LP, and get that over to you. So that's pretty cool.
After listening to this episode, if you're not already on the Mind Games hype train, I think you'll be excited to enter.
Yes, this will be a good primer episode for really immersing yourself in the Mind Games world. And there's so much to do, and the packages are great. So you'll definitely want to enter for your copy.
Yes, immersing you shall do.
Yes.
This is one of the biggest sets that I've ever seen come out.
I know.
And there is a limited edition super deluxe, but I'm not even talking about that. The regular deluxe is so comprehensive just on its own.
There's so many goodies. Obviously, there's a whole secret part of it that is to the naked eye not even obvious, but it takes it to the next level.
Sean Lennon was the lead producer on this, and he's really outdone himself.
Yeah, it's so great. It's so great. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So should we talk a little bit about Mind Games, the album itself?
Yeah, let's go back to Beatles in the 70s, a place where we've been living for quite some time now.
I know. This is our Beatles in the 70s era. We're in it.
I love it. I love it.
So as we recently mentioned in our Ringo episode,
John in 1973 was not in the best stage of his life. He was coming off the massive flop of his Sometime in New York City album. He had a lot of immigration troubles. He was the target of the Nixon administration, and he was having some trouble with Yoko. Not great.
Not good.
But in August of that year, John went back into the studio to record his 4th album. Here he decided to take a turn back into the personal realm of songwriting and away from the heavy political overtones that Sometime in New York City had.
He also wrote this album over a very short period of time and recorded it in even less time. With the exception of 2 tracks, the title track and Free the People, John wrote these new songs during the week of July 16th. He then went in the studio to record over 5 days in August, the 1st through the 5th, with overdubs the following 10 days. Mixing and mastering came the month after, and then it was released on August 29th, 1973. John did produce this himself. It was his first solo album entirely on his own without Phil Spector.
Yeah, it's a very short-lived break from Phil there. He would find himself in good old Los Angeles not long after with some interesting Phil sessions at A&M Studios. So yeah, in the Mind Games book, John describes the album as an interim record between being a manic political lunatic and going back to being a musician again. He said, Mind Games is like the cross between them. I was really playing Mind Games. I had had enough of trying to be deep and thought, why can't I have some fun? And my idea of fun with music was to sing. I like to say what a wonderfully simple album it is. And I think that is a really good summation of Mind Games. There is a lot of fun. There's a lot of deep stuff. I think he undersells the album. I don't think it's really that simple, when you dig deep into it. But I do think he is hitting it on the head with how fun it is in a lot of parts. There's a lot of fun elements on the album.
John brought in his longtime friend, Jim Keltner, on the drums, and he filled out the band with some of the finest session musicians the New York City rock world had to offer. Many of these folks had also been part of Yoko's recent album, Feeling the Space, which she had recorded just prior to Mind Games. He jokingly called them the Plastic U.F.Ono Band.
I want that on a t-shirt.
1973 was a couple of years before he actually claimed to see a UFO. So he had UFOs on the mind all the way back to 73.
He was manifesting a UFO.
Yeah, there you go, right? Crazy. So the Plastic U.F.Ono Band, in addition to Jim Keltner, also included the incredible David Spinoza on guitar, pianist Ken Asher, bassist Gordon Edwards,
pedal steel player Sneaky Pete Kleinow,
saxophonist Michael Breckner, and a second drummer, Rick Marotta.
What a crack team of musicians. And I think out of all of them, I mean, they all had their time to shine on this record. But as I was listening to the Ultimate Mixes, like, good God, Sneaky Pete, he is a real superstar on this thing on pedal steel.
Yeah, what an interesting instrument, right?
I know, I love it. And again, getting ahead of myself, but it really like makes the album sort of slide into the genre of what was so popular at the time too, which was, that country rock fusion. And it kind of it like dips its toe into that puddle with Sneaky Pete and his prowess on the pedal steel. It's so good.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a cool element to this.
Yeah.
So the title track, as we mentioned before, John had started this one, unlike many of the others, a few years earlier. Back then, when he made a demo of it, it was called Make Love, Not War. But he changed the lyrics to Mind Games after reading a book called Mind Games, The Guide to Inner Space, a 1972 book which theorized that humans could enact global change just by tapping into their own mental potential. Sounds very 70s John to me.
Yes, indeed.
And in that spirit, the idea of Mind Games has a positive message to achieve world peace in a more innovative, creative way. A message of peace that's much less militant and in your face than his previous peace offerings had been. But, looking at the cover art, which John designed, there could be an alternate meaning. So I think this cover is very interesting. It's a collage piece that John designed himself, and it depicts a very, very small John standing alone in a field. And beyond that field, in the horizon, is a giant image of Yoko's face, almost as if it were a mountain range in the landscape. So John's there being dwarfed by this giant image of Yoko. This is also the time when John and Yoko's marriage was hitting that huge impasse.
Right. As we talked to May Pang about on a recent episode as well, she talked a lot about being at the Mind Game sessions and obviously accompanying John to LA after. It was towards the end of the Mind Game sessions that Yoko asked John to leave, and he asked May Pang to be his lover. And so this would begin the 18-month quote unquote lost weekend period of John's life and his love affair with May.
This is an interesting transition album because when it started, he was with Yoko. And when it ended, he was with May.
Pretty much living with May, yeah.
And that's just a month, 1 month.
We've always said Beatle time makes no sense, and that extends to their solo careers as well. Beatle time, the limit does not exist. It's too weird.
Now, Sean Lennon had a slightly different outlook on this. He talked about the cover in a recent article in Variety. He said, quote, "What really struck me in this case with this album is people always talk about how they went through a separation. And my dad went to LA and all this stuff happened. And I find it really remarkable how clear it is that he was committed to my mom and was in love with her even in this supposedly troubled time. On the album, he made her a giant mountain, and he's this tiny little figure dwarfed by her kind of incredible magnificence. And all the songs are basically about how much he loves her. So it was very touching in a way, because I went into it thinking, oh, this is the album right after he went to LA and that lost weekend happened. What struck me is that even at the time, there was zero doubt, if you pay attention, that he was in love with my mother and was committed to her in the ways that matter most.
Very interesting, Sean. Very interesting observation. I think history might interpret it a little bit differently.
As with May Pang.
As with May Pang, I think that obviously Sean has a little bit of a bias, and that's okay. That's okay. And I do think he has a point in some of the songs, but as we're going to talk about, I think him sort of saying this album is sort of a testament to his like unwavering love for Yoko. I think there are definitely some big moments of doubt on this album, big questions that he's asking himself about their relationship. And obviously, there are some songs we're going to talk about that were recorded after they'd separated. And those are some of the love songs, so certainly he was still thinking about Yoko, but I think he definitely did have this other relationship going on in his life at the time as well. So it was complicated. I think, it's obviously hard for Sean. These are his parents, but I think it was a really complicated time in John's life. Sean did a great job with this. This series is his first foray sort of into producing his father's recordings, touching them in this way. And I think he does it in such a loving manner. The ultimate mixes are amazing, and we're going to talk about those. But as far as the album in and of itself, as his relationship to it, I could see him discovering new things just by listening to it, really like intensely working on it. And that's the thing about music, right? Is you can read whatever you want into it. So it's up for interpretation. And, he's not wrong, but I think he's not 100% right historically. But that's okay. He can take his interpretation and create this beautiful piece of art with it. And it's great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. What was your experience or impression of Mind Games before the release came out?
I thought about how to answer this question because I knew we were going to talk about it and how honest I wanted to be with you guys, because I didn't want to get backlash, but I never really listened to it, like ever. I mean, I knew the title track, obviously, but I never listened to the rest of the album, maybe once or twice, like a long time ago, but I wasn't really familiar with the rest of it. And so I sort of came to this set as almost like a brand new listener. I'm kind of glad I did, because it gave me that really holistic experience of all these different mixes and the different audio documentaries and the beautiful book, and really getting into the weeds with it. So I didn't really have an impression of it. I just sort of wrote it off as like a mid-70s John album, right? When he and Yoko were going through it, and right before his foray to LA. And, I just put it in that compartment and left it there. But now my opinion's changed, and I really, really like the album a lot. It's probably one of my favorites, to be honest, because I think there's just so much to love about it musically. What about you, Erika? What was your impressions/experiences with Mind Games?
Around 2005, I had one of my first office jobs. And it was also a big time for internet radio stations, right? And I found this one called Maca Radio, and this guy, Mike from Canada, ran it.
I kind of remember that.
Oh my God, it was so good. It was so good. And at the time, I didn't know a ton of John, George, or Ringo solo outside the big hits. So I would put this internet radio on all day while I was doing this boring job and just had the Beatles on constantly. And he played a lot of solo albums in addition to Beatles and a lot of deep cuts. So I really learned the majority of my John, George, and Ringo solo songs through this radio station, which means I know all the songs, but I can't put them in context of what album they were on, what year. I just don't know, right?
Yeah. How ironic that you learned all this about John, George, and Ringo from a radio station called Maca Radio.
I know, right? I know.
That's so funny.
To be fair, he did the same for Paul, but I already knew those, so it didn't matter as much to me.
Yeah.
But, this is learning in the internet age, right? Albums are less of a thing unless you consciously choose to listen to an album start to finish. So I never really knew what was on it.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting to hear this in the historical context of the album, especially when we're getting so much of the history and the process with all these different versions we get in the box set.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a puzzle. When you put it together, you kind of get this picture of what the album is and also where John was at the time. But I also think like we're kind of #blessed, and our listeners too, if you guys have hung with us over the past couple of months, because we really, really, really dug into the 70s with the Beatles. So this is just a continuation of it. But I feel like because of that, I can kind of climb into John's head a little bit more, knowing where like the Beatles were legally at this time, and with the Alan Klein stuff. And certainly reading the book that comes with the deluxe set, they talk about Alan Klein in there, and they talk about, where John was with his immigration stuff. And we covered all that. We covered in Utopia. We had May Pang on with the Ringo album even. So I think coming to Mind Games with all that, it really like super front loaded our experience with this box.
And it makes it so much richer in a way, because even though it was such a small blip in time, just a month.
Yeah, I know, which is crazy.
We now have all of this deep knowledge about what was happening in and around his life. And that helps us understand the intensity of, as you said before, Beatle time, right?
So crazy.
So Mind Games is the third John Lennon solo album to get this kind of box set remix treatment following the Imagine and John Lennon and Yoko Ono Plastic U.F.Ono Band Ultimate Collection. Yeah, sadly, no one's doing some time in New York City yet. Maybe it'll come. Probably never. I don't know.
Don't quote me on that, but I think it was planned and then abandoned. There's a couple of things that maybe make it a little bit difficult to touch.
Well, that makes sense. It's a problematic album.
Yeah, it's still not going to get its moment. It can hang out in the archives for a bit.
So the same team that worked on the other two Ultimate Collections worked on this, executive produced by Sean, and the engineering was led by Grammy Award-winning engineer Paul Hicks, with Sam Gannon and Rob Stevens doing some of the mixes too. This new set offers 6 different versions of Mind Games.
So crazy.
So this is what we got. First off, the Ultimate Mixes. This is closest to John's original, but remixed from the ground up by Sean, Paul Hicks, and Sam Gannon. This is equivalent to the kind of work that Giles Martin does with the Beatles albums, bringing it into a sound space that makes sense to contemporary listeners. Sean was actually saying in some of the press around this that one of the reasons he thought this might have been more overlooked was that this is the first album that John mixed himself. He produced it himself, and Sean was gently saying that maybe the end part of creating an album, the production side, wasn't necessarily in John's wheelhouse, wasn't the part that he liked the most. And here he was doing it in this super compressed timetable. A lot of people at the time in the original reviews of this material did say that the mix was fairly small and flat, which could certainly lead people to not having the same listening experience that they might have when they're listening to John Lennon mixed by Phil Spector with a wall of sound behind it.
Yeah, small and flat is definitely the opposite of the wall of sound, for sure.
Yeah. And I think the Ultimate Mixes bridge the gap between those two. So you've got a very contemporary feel, you've got these incredible session musicians, and you really hear all of the genius they brought to this album.
Yeah.
It's the most mainstream of all the recordings, too. Then you have album number 2. These are the Elemental Mixes. This is a more stripped down version of the original, more of an acoustic feel, no drums, more emphasis on John's voice. So your Let It Be Naked version of Mind Games.
Right. And some of them really do bring a different vibe. You kind of can hear different musical styles that come out.
Yeah.
As they remove elements. We'll get into that more on the track by track, but it really kind of recontextualizes them in different ways. It's really interesting.
And then you have the Elements Mixes. This is a more experimental version of the songs. It's as stripped down as possible, meaning no more than 3 instruments heard at any one time. And there are little to no vocals, no John vocals at all throughout the entire Elements mix. This really brings out the beauty of specific lines, kind of spotlights some of the brilliant instruments in the album. But it's certainly different. It's weird. It's a weird mix.
I was thinking as I was listening to it, I'm like, oh, I could do some really strange karaoke to this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think the only vocals, if I am remembering correctly, I think there are vocals from Something Different, who are the quartet of female backup singers on the album. I think they appear in the Elemental Mixes as maybe an instrument themselves a couple of times, which is beautiful. But yeah, the Elements Mixes are really it's cool. I love to hear a good bass line, and damn, some of those bass lines slap.
Gordon is a master. Oh my God.
Oh, totally. Totally. There's so much good bass on this album. No offense, Paul McCartney, but the bass is great. Bass game strong.
More than one person can play brilliant bass in the world.
It's true. It's true. With John Lennon.
On behalf of the apologist, we're fine. We're good with this.
Okay, Miss Kiss is on the bottom. I get it.
Yes, we can coexist.
Yes, I think John would want that for this album.
I think so, too. I mean, he did want that. He certainly didn't ask Paul to play on the album.
True.
The next album we have is called the Evolution Documentary. So many E-names, it's hard to keep them straight.
A lot of alliteration here.
Yeah. And this is not a video documentary, it's an audio-only documentary. So what it does is it maps out each song on the album chronologically from the first audio demo up to the final. So you hear a kind of montage of how the song progressed from its first stage to the very end.
The fun thing about the Evolution documentaries, too, is there's a lot of studio chatter.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff that John says is hilarious. Like, I always love when he drops an F-bomb.
Yes.
He's always like, where's my fucking cigarettes? At one point, he's yelling at Jim Keltner and Rick Marotta, and he's like, there's two fucking drummers in here, figure it out. Like, I'm just looking for a fucking backbeat.
If you look at it on Spotify, you'll see that a few of these documentary tracks received an explicit rating.
Oh,
but only
funny.
A few of them. So if you look down on Spotify, you can see where the F-bombs show up.
There you go. That's a good life hack.
Yeah.
If you just want to hear John swear a lot, then just listen to those.
No more searching for it inside Hey Jude. You can just hear it.
Yeah, exactly. It's less of an Easter egg when you listen to it on Spotify.
The fifth album in this set is the Raw Studio Mix. It's exactly what it sounds like. These are as close as we get to being at the record plant in 1973 as they were recording the album. They're nearly exact replicas of what was recorded in the sessions without all the effects that were put on the final mixes. It especially shows off John's natural vocals, which of course he always tried to hide. So if you really want to hear what John sounded like, and he sounded great in 1973, this is the mix for you. And then finally, we have the Outtakes album, what the producers judged to be the single best alternate take from every song on Mind Games.
It is very, very comprehensive. You have everything you could ever need to like explore this album front to back to center. And I like to, in the book that comes with the Super Deluxe set, they have the different takes like broken down. Like, for example, like in the Evolution documentaries, they have all the take numbers, the dates, when it was recorded and how it was recorded. You can kind of follow along in the book. So you kind of got all the information there. If you really want to dig into the intricacies of the recording process, you can do that.
And speaking of the book, all 6 of these albums are available on Spotify. So everybody has access to these. But if you did want to drop a few bucks, we get into some really cool extra pieces that are included in the deluxe version. So in the deluxe version, the coffee table book that you just mentioned is a wonderful edition. I always love a book like this. And it tells the story of every song in the album with both archival interviews from John and Yoko and all the personnel, and also new interviews with the Plastic U.F.Ono Band, mostly just for this book. So that's really fun. Also supplemented with never-before-seen photos from photographer Bob Gruen, as well as pictures of memorabilia from this time from John and Yoko's archives, mostly tape machines and other things involved in the recording especially.
I love the new interviews with Plastic U.F.Ono Band.
Yeah.
They sort of do some of them while they are listening to the Ultimate Mixes or have just listened to them, because they sort of talk about like, oh, I forgot this instrument was on this track. And it's a real highlight to be able to hear that. Or, you know, it's these memories of recording with John and how he was, you know, like to work in the studio and how Yoko was when she was in the studio. You really do feel like you're in the studio with them. You can kind of picture it as you're reading their interviews.
Even though some of them really only spent a little over a week with John, others in this group, like David Spinoza, has a long history with both John and Yoko. And Jim Keltner was everywhere at this time. So it's not just their experiences of a week in the studio, but really we get to hear new perspectives on John and how John works in the studio. Very cool.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not all, folks. Super Deluxe also contains a reproduction of the original marketing poster and postcard-sized versions of 2 other posters,
A Citizen of Newtopia ID card,
and a number of other things, including a bunch of Easter eggs scattered throughout the box set. So happy hunting.
I still need to fire up my old blacklight. I hear that's very handy when playing the mind game that is this box set.
There's so much in there. It's insane. And this isn't even the crazy release. Have you seen the Super Deluxe? Oh my God.
It is a crazy town.
It's a limited run of just 1,100 copies. If you can find one, they're selling for like $1,300. I've seen it on eBay for double that.
Oh my.
It's crazy. But this is an enormous piece. It's a 12-inch cube that's essentially an art piece that was modeled after one of Yoko's art pieces. It has all this crazy stuff in there. Like, I'm not even going to go into it because A, I don't have it, and B, there's just too much to talk about. But take a look at John Lennon's website. You can see a breakdown. And a few people who did buy it have done some great unboxing videos on YouTube and on TikTok. It's really interesting.
Yeah. If I can recommend one unboxing, it is Elliot Mintz. He does a great unboxing on his Instagram, I think. And I think we shared it on our Instagram story when he did it, but I'll reshare it when this episode comes out. So if you missed it, you can see it because, I mean, he is just a delight. Anyway, he was very involved in John's life when John was in LA. He's still very good friends with Yoko. So, of course, he got a big box and he, unboxed that sucker. And it's great.
And again, it's the same music we're all getting even on Spotify, but what it is an art piece. So if you really appreciate this kind of thing and you're having fun exploring John Lennon's world at the time, it's there for you. It's very interesting. And then beyond the box sets, there's even a little bit more out there. You can register your own Newtopian citizenship at citizenofnewtopia.com. We talked a lot about that in our Newtopia episode a couple of months ago. And Sean has also said that a lot more is coming to that site later in the year. So sign up now so you can get notified of the other things that are happening there.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see what else they're doing.
Keeps the party going.
And then this last thing is a partnership with the Illuminate app. Have you heard about this?
I've seen Sean post about it, but I haven't really explored it. So tell us what Illuminate is.
Okay, so Illuminate is this meditation app that uses a variety of light patterns that are done with a flashlight on your phone and audio like binaural beats to create a meditation experience that many people have compared to a psychedelic trip without the LSD.
Wow.
So there are 9 Mind Games inspired soundscapes on the app, but I can't do it. I have chronic migraines and I can't do things that have like strobes. I feel really sad I can't try it. It looks so interesting.
I'll do it and I'll report back.
It looks really cool.
I'll download it now that I know what it is. I inferred from his post that it was sort of a meditation thing, but I was sort of confused. So I'm glad that you sort of did the boots on the ground work. And if you guys have tried it, let us know. Let us know what your experience is with Illuminate.
So with these huge comprehensive packages of music and physical media and online media, this is one of the most super of super deluxe releases in the Beatles world that we've gotten. And that led me to ask, why is Mind Games getting this sort of treatment? It's always been known as one of the more middling John Lennon solo albums. And Sean had a great answer to this in a recent article in Variety. He said, quote, "Well, for me personally, Mind Games was always one of my favorite albums and certainly one of my favorite John Lennon albums. So I felt like it was just an amazing opportunity to be able to work on music that I really loved from my father. But then there's another level to it, which is that at the time it came out, it was sort of not very well received, and I think it fell through the cracks a little bit. So I felt lucky to have this chance to reinvestigate an album that I always felt was really amazing and to try to represent it to the world in a way that gave it a second chance." And he went on to say that his goal with the album is, quote, "someone who had heard it before, but it never really clicked, might reinvestigate it and give it another chance." And I've heard a lot of people who do have that experience. They didn't think much of Mind Games, and then they dig into this, and they're like, wow, okay, this is actually great.
Well, that makes me feel kind of good that I hadn't really had an experience with it, because I feel like I'm hearing it the correct way for the first time.
So when Sean was going through it, he was listening to every song and thinking about it. Like, what was John's real meaning for it? What kind of John Lennon song is it? What area does it fall into? So maybe like one, if for example, has more of a later Lennon double fantasy sort of vibe, and he was trying to bring that out in a mix in the way that really brought out what he thought John would have meant by it.
Yeah, well, that's good. And obviously Sean was onto something. I've heard criticism of Sean's mixes where he drops out certain instruments that are really intrinsic to the mix and that kind of thing. But I didn't hear that. And not that, I'm not the expert, obviously, because this is my first real experience with the album. But having, listened to the mixes, the ultimate mixes, listening to all the different mixes, Particularly, I heard a rumor that some saxophone is missing on these, but I'm like, I hear some great saxophone solos from Michael Brecker, and I'm not hearing a missing sax from mix to mix. There's a missing sax. It's got to be because, it's like an elements mix where it's, not spotlighting the sax or, something like that. But I don't really have an issue with Sean's mixes. I thought they sounded great. I could definitely see the comparison between him and Giles. And yeah, I really enjoyed them. I think that made listening to the album a really dynamic experience.
Yeah, I'll say the same thing. I don't really know what people aren't hearing, and I can't speak on that because I don't know. But as far as overall listening experience, it's certainly very full. It doesn't feel like something's missing.
Yeah.
So the album dropped last week, and the celebration kicked off with a number of events. First, it started in Liverpool on July 6th, already a holiday in Beatles history, the day John met Paul, with a scavenger hunt around the city. And this looks so much fun, and I wish I could have gone.
I know. I was having so much fun, like watching the hashtag on Instagram of people doing it.
Yeah.
It was so fun.
Now, some people were given one of the Liverpool maps that was designed for the Mind Games Super Deluxe box. And they're so cool. They incorporate John's face into a map of Liverpool with all these different sites on it. And there's a book that comes with it describing all the sites. And then if you look at it with a black light, all these different clues show up around Liverpool. And they had a scavenger hunt to go find those items around the city. So yeah, really cool.
I would frame the shit out of that poster.
I know.
That is so cool. And I think there is also one designed for Yoko of Tokyo.
Yes, there is.
They did a scavenger hunt around Tokyo on the 13th, I believe.
Oh, it's so good.
Well, from Liverpool to Tokyo.
Yeah, and the maps are so beautiful.
They're so beautiful. I love that John one so much.
It's gorgeous, and it's huge. I think it's like 48 inches square or something.
I would love to hang that on my wall. I'm so jealous of the people that got one in Liverpool. Yeah.
Also, a new immersive audio documentary premiered on SiriusXM's Beatles channel called Lennon 360. It was also produced by Sean Lennon, and the first of the 4-episode documentary was about the making of Mind Games. And then finally, there were listening events in both New York City and London, and I was lucky enough to get invited to the one in New York, and it was amazing.
Yes, and you haven't told me anything about this, so I'm dying to know all about it.
Just so amazing. I mean, you go to these things and they have it in this Atmos playback room. So all the speakers are placed for ultimate Atmos listening, and not having a stereo system like this at home. It's such a change to be able to listen like that. It's like you're in a swimming pool full of sounds. It's the most amazing experience.
Yeah.
So we heard the whole album. And they also played us the demo of John's I Am the Greatest. And since we just talked about that for our Ringo episode a couple of weeks ago, it was especially delightful. And then the most fabulous thing happened. They had a 50-year reunion and a Q&A with all of the members of the Plastic U.F.Ono Band who played on Mind Games. It was incredible.
Oh my God.
So everybody except Jim Keltner joined in person. And Keltner joined via Zoom because I think he's on tour with Dylan right now. Also, Bob Gruen was there, and it was so cool to see these guys together. They all were saying, like, this is the first time they've intentionally been together, like all of them at the same time since they made Mind Games.
Oh my God. I was going to say, this is probably, like, when else would they all get together like this again?
Yeah, because, of course, they're session musicians. So they all moved on to do a lot of incredible things, but never really as musical partners themselves. And so here are just a couple of highlights from the Q&A. Jim Keltner called the time playing with John, quote, one of the greatest experiences of my life.
That's saying a lot because Keltner has done so many things.
And then the moderator asked them if hearing the album transported them back to that time. And David Spinoza quickly quipped back, yeah, and all the fear came right back too. So yeah, that felt like a very honest and very funny response.
Yes, very, very honest.
Yeah, they had some great banter together. They were totally busting each other up the whole time. It was so funny. They're hilarious, especially Keltner. Another interesting question they got was, what was it like to work with John versus working with Paul and versus working with George? So a number of them gave responses to this, but the gist of it was that, and I think this feels pretty true to form, Paul was much more into the minute production details, so he might, quote, listen to the bass track for an hour, while John was freer, and that while he was all business in the studio, he was not a micromanager. Paul, however, had a very clear idea of what he would want, like a guitar solo, and the musicians were, quote, trying to give back what Paul asked for. And then the difference between John and George, Jim Keltner was able to speak to this directly. He said that George and George's arrangements at the time were much more complicated and had more chord progressions. While he said, quote, John's music wrote itself. And he also recalled that it was always easy playing with John.
I feel like you really hear that in the Evolution documentaries, audio documentaries in this box too, because, there are parts where, Gordon sort of guides John on the bass and, obviously Keltner's there for a big, backbeat, but I feel like you hear them sort of collaborating. Whereas, we've all heard demos of Paul in the studio where he is very much like, he hears something in his head and wants it to be recreated.
Mm-hmm. And he either gets that out of his musicians or he just does it himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas I think John was much more like, this is a collaboration and let's jam. Let's see what happens.
Well, I think John, and this is a much bigger conversation that we can save for another episode, but I think John was the one out of the two who benefited most from collaborations. Like he really needed a collaborator. Paul, I think like he has definitely benefited from collaborations and he sort of found those over the years. But I think John was the one who really liked, being with people in the studio and kind of like being creative with people.
I think Paul also likes that feeling while at the same time not being willing to give up total control of what the outcome is.
Yeah.
And of course, last but not least, I can't forget to mention that in addition to Bob Gruen and the Plastic U.F.Ono Band, Sean was there too. It was so nice that he was there. And we have a photo that I took of Sean with a bunch of the Plastic U.F.Ono Band, so we could post that this week.
I'm so glad you went to that event, and that is so cool that they reunited the Plastic U.F.Ono Band. That is like once in a lifetime.
And I think we'll end it today. This is going to have to be a two-parter. We dove so deep into this Mind Games box set that we have a whole second episode with just the track-by-track and final impressions of the album. So we'll be back next week with that. And if you're interested, all 6 albums from the Mind Games box set are available anywhere you buy records or on Spotify or Apple Music. So listen to it over the next week and go track by track along with us and let us know what you thought.
Yes, indeed. That was so much fun. I'm so glad we got to talk about Mind Games today. And I hope that you guys will all enter our giveaway so you can get your own copy. And if you don't want to wait, just go to johnlennon.com or wherever you get your music and you can find the Mind Games boxes. And if you got one or if you got the big set, let us know how much you love it. Let us know, everything about it. What's your favorite part? What your favorite songs are? Just let us know.
We want to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you so much for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And yes, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, and TikTok, and YouTube if you'd like. We'll be posting photos, videos, and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com as well. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.